Greetings, lover of Wikipedia articles accompanied by slowly moving images. Today, I will tell you about a plate sword. What is it, why the heck do you need it, and what to do with it? The plate sword is a special fantasy type of weapon with a blade that can be separated into multiple component parts, transforming it into a whip. Of course, creating such a device in reality is not easy. In this issue, we will analyze the plate sword whip for its realism and functionality in actual combat, and also explore whether similar weapons truly existed in our world. In recent times, the topic of fantasy weapons has been frequently featured on YouTube. However, the plate sword is the most unrealistic model of imaginary weaponry among the rest. The plate sword is a fairly common weapon in video games, films, and even anime. I believe most people became familiar with it after watching the anime Bleach or playing Prince of Persia, Bloodborne, or other similar games. In these games, the sword is portrayed as a very agile and effective weapon. Essentially, this weapon can be described as a multi-component blade strung on a thread. The main problem with this weapon is the return mechanism. In games, this is solved with magic. But in our world, it doesn't work so well, since we don't import mana.
Line ticket, it's not a magic trick, Brandon.
On one hand, to disassemble the blade into pieces, it is sufficient to attach a steel cable to it and attach intermediate parts of the blade to it, insert a ribbon spring into the hilt, and make a fastener that will secure the cable in the unfolded state. The mechanism is almost like that of a vacuum cleaner cable. To unwind the cable, you need to press a button and throw the blade forward with the force of inertia. However, considering that the spring needs to be powerful enough to join the blade links into a solid monolithic structure, you would need to possess the strength of Superman to be able to do it. Moreover, the strength of such a construction in its assembled state would be low due to strong impacts against a hard surface. The composite parts of the blade will bend. Also, even if you solve this problem, how can you make sure that the composite parts of the blade step back from each other at an equal distance without shaking freely like beads on a string? The thing is, you can't.
Oh no, you can't.
It is possible to secure them with forging, but then the rope will not move through the holes in the links of the blade, and it seems impossible to put all the parts together. Even if the blade parts are not fastened to the rope, a big problem will be the correct and even joining of the groove to groove after the spring begins to wind the rope, so it is better to make the composite parts sharp on both sides to avoid at least the problem with the inverted parts. Even so, without the use of magic, assembling such a blade would be problematic. Even assuming that we have electricity. In theory, with the help of electricity, it is possible to create a mechanism that functions on the principle as in games. For this, a power of alternating current electromagnets will be needed. By the way, will not solve all the problems. In the case of a sword mechanism functioning on an electromagnet, a not very strong spring but a very strong current source should be installed in their handle, which will magnetize the blade back to the handle. However, based on this, the sword will only be solid while the current is flowing. So, it turns out that the battery capacity should be of sizable dimensions and it will not fit inside the handle. But if you want to fight with this sword for longer than a few minutes, let's say we were able to make such a sword, even using modern technology, and then what? Do we have super cold weapons in our hands? No.
Look, I know it's terrible.
In theory, this thing can disarm an enemy like a whip and even cut a little at the same time, but whether it will work well is a big question. Because the cutting edge of the blade is not solid like a normal sword, these interruptions will create problems. If the angle of such a link gets caught on the edge of the enemy armor plate, there is a chance that you could injure your own hand or break a piece of the blade, or maybe both at the same time. Speaking of blade breakage, in reality, the blade of a sword is constantly covered with nicks during use, and as I already mentioned, in the links of such a flexible blade, there should be milled grooves to be able to reassemble it. If during a strike, the enemy's weapon or armor deforms the composite part of the blade a bit, you won't be able to reassemble it again. That's why such a sword is actually very fragile and will only be effective against an enemy without armor. In actual history, there was a type of weapon similar to a plate sword. Interestingly, almost all the problems and limitations described by me about the plate sword are relevant to its real analog. We are talking about the Yarumi, a flexible sword originating from India. This weapon consists of a typical sword handle and a blade that is a long strip of very flexible steel. The length of the Yurumi blade ranged from 1 to 2 meters, and the width of the steel ribbon was 23 centimeters to maintain the weapon's strength. The blade of such a sword was very thin, which means it had to be very sharp. Like the plate sword, it was simply because it was not suitable for fighting a well-protected opponent, so it should at least inflict maximum possible damage to unarmed opponents. Apparently, the creators of the kurumi were guided by the same logic. This weapon was not intended for fighting a well-protected opponent, but left monstrous wounds on unprotected bodies. According to legends, the Yurumi is attributed to incredible horror and literally cutting out pieces of flesh from the human body, ending with much more terrible things. It should be added that parrying a strike from a flexible sword is practically impossible. Just look at the speed with which the master wields this thing. A shield is also not a panacea because a flexible sword is flexible precisely so that it can bypass a static obstacle. These advantages can also be added to the imaginary plate sword. Now, as for the negative aspects of the flexible sword, aside from the inability to pierce steel armor, all the advantages of the Yurumi can also be considered as disadvantages. It is not very effective to wield the sword in indoor or tight formations, and as for parrying strikes, it is true that strikes from a flexible sword cannot be parried, but the flexible blade is also unable to parry the opponent's strikes. Moreover, mastering such a weapon is very difficult. An untrained fighter is more likely to cut themselves into pieces than to harm their opponent. Anyone who wishes to master the technique of fighting with a Yurumi weapon must spend about 12 years of regular training, so the difficult mastery of the flexible sword is its additional disadvantage. As we can see from the example of the Yurumi, the flexible plate sword is a highly specific and ambiguous weapon in real history.
You're right. It's shit.
It is believed that the Yurumi was often used by assassins due to the possibility of easily disguising the sword as part of clothing, but even this option is absent in games featuring plate swords. Simply put, a person with a sword cannot be allowed where a sword is prohibited, and the fact that the sword can be unfolded is only an additional reason for security to confiscate the weapon. Therefore, in our world, such a sword would have absolutely no practical use. In reality, a multi-component sword is simply a useless thing. It is almost impossible to create, and the possible options impose a lot of uncompensated difficulties in both manufacturing and use. The blade of such a sword is fragile and will not be able to penetrate an enemy's armor due to the specific application of force during strikes, and it will also require a very long time to learn to use. The only advantages are its flexibility, the ability to disarm an opponent, and the impossibility of parrying strikes. However, except for the ability to grab someone else's weapon, the Yurumi possesses all the advantages and surpasses the fictional plate sword in every aspect. What do you think about such swords? Write in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video.